Hi, I'm Kat,
Hi, and I'm Vinnie.
and this week we're going to present on organizational variables, effectiveness, and power.
And we're going to further break it down to organizational deviance and termination, then into interagency collaboration, and finally we're going to conclude in power in organizations.
I'm going to begin this week's presentation speaking about optimization, deviance, and termination. And basically we're going to start this off by talking about what explains failure in criminal justice agencies. Organizational deviance is basically an unwanted outcome as a result of formal organizations deviating from their goals and standards of performance. So that's basically what leads to the failure of a criminal justice system. And the issues that arise as a result of an organizational error, such as the wrongful conviction of Sutton, as we read in the first part of this chapter, are not typically caused by one person, but it's kind of a group effort among the different parts, but they can be caused by one person. We're going to talk about the organizational characteristics that contribute to the organizational deviance. The first one is going to be administrative breakdown, and this occurs when management is unable to appropriately implement structures. An example of this would be the Penitentiary of New Mexico in 1980. Basically what happened there is a well-respected former warden weakened the hierarchy in the prison of those positions that were held above him and below him. And the weakening made it difficult to change disciplinary policies, and they were trying to implement increased use of solitary confinement. Subordinates did not want to follow the orders of those above them, and there were frequent escapes and instances of violence that showed the inmates that control was being lost within the facility. Thus, a riot ensued, and 12 correctional officers were taken hostage and assaulted. 33 inmates were killed, and 200 others were injured within a 2-day period. The next organizational characteristic that can contribute to organizational deviance is structural secrecy and knowledge conflict. Structural secrecy is the inability of knowledge to be disseminated between and within organizations. And basically we can use the 3 dimensions of complexity that we learned previously, which is the horizontal, vertical, and spatial dimensions of complexity, and an example of the inability of knowledge to be disseminated would be 9/11, when the FBI had 3 different investigations occurring within different field offices. The other officers were unaware of the information being gathered, and this information was not being shared between them. And this would be an example of having a large spatial. As they were spread apart, they weren't able to talk with each other, and obviously they didn't have the same supervisor. It was the local people in that office. But basically the end result is that it caused the details and size of the 9/11 plot to remain unknown. Knowledge conflict, that is when management does not see the events the same way as line level employees. So an example of this would be the launch of the Challenger. Engineers did not agree with the decision to launch the shuttle because it was cold. And even though that there was like a 1 in 100,000 chance that something bad would happen, based on their experiential knowledge, they thought that that statistic didn't mean anything and that the shuttle shouldn't be launched. But due to the fact they were unable to supply quantifiable data, their knowledge that they gained from experience was ignored, and as a result, 7 astronauts died. It's very often that managerial knowledge is typically held higher than experiential knowledge, which is normally gained by the line level workers. And basically, it's a concept of quantitative versus experiential information. The third type of organizational characteristic that contributes to organizational deviance is going to be normal accidents. And basically, these are inevitable problems within an organization. Now, this isn't saying that it's acceptable for these to happen. It's just saying that based on the way the organization is run, it's probable that these accidents will occur. And basically the things that affect it are complexity and coupling. The more tightly coupled, the higher the likelihood that something negative will occur, as they involve different parts of a system that work closely together towards the same goal. So if you picture the scenario of, say, a car or walking behind someone in the hallway, if you walk too close, you don't have time to absorb it because you're very tightly coupled with the people in front of you. However, if you left more space, you have more opportunity to react. And complex systems are comprised of many parts, making it difficult to account for all the different parts and ensure that everyone are on the same page. So picture it as you're walking through a busy city street. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, and it's kind of hard to make sure that you know everything that's going on. So the more complex a system is, the harder it is to control. And then crisis mismanagement or management is the last characteristic that contributes to organizational deviance. And basically, management becomes an important aspect if accidents are inevitable, as we talked about normal accidents before. So basically, an example of mismanagement would be, again, the prison riot, because a plan existed for riots, but for some reason they were unable to find it, yet the inmates were able to circulate copies of it. And then in some situations we have what's called crisis paralysis. Again, we can relate this to the prison riots, as local police were asked for assistance, but there were differences in the chain of command, and thus directions weren't received efficiently, and nothing was done. It's basically the failure to implement an effective response, which obviously was not done if orders cannot be received. And the actual management part, that's the most important, is bringing the system back to normal after the crisis. And the management characteristic is the most important, as effective management can mitigate the negative outcomes, such as death, damage, and injury that can result of the crises. And how can we prevent organizational deviance? The book talked about highly reliable organizations, or HROs, and these are organizations that are able to maintain their operations despite dealing with unexpected changes. And there's 5 characteristics. Basically, HROs are preoccupied with failure. They're reluctant to reduce situations to simple explanations. They're sensitive to the operations of other organizations. And they're resilient, which means they're essentially effectively handling the unexpected challenges and situations. And they also defer to the expertise within the organization. So I'm going to break these down a little bit. Basically, being preoccupied with failure means that they put mechanisms in place to detect failures, and give them an opportunity to fix them, and learn so that way that failure won't be repeated. The fact that they're reluctant to look at the simple solution means that they're looking at a wide range of possibilities. They're not looking for the simplest solution, such as blaming one single employee, as it could be something way bigger that they'd want to address before it becomes too serious. Being sensitive to the other operations within an organization, and they understand how they work and how they interact with each other, so this is going to increase the ability for information to be traded between the different operations within an organization. Being resilient. Basically, if you consider situations ahead of time, it allows for an effective response, as these situations have already been reflected upon and a plan can be created. So the fact that they're doing that is going to increase their reliability. And when they defer to the expertise within an organization, they're speaking to the experts in the organization that can guide people through crises, because sometimes following like a rigid set plan is not the correct response to certain crises, and these people might know more as the situation is specific. We're also going to talk about organizational termination, which is basically when the organization doesn't recover from the crises. It's not a simple process to identify, and there are many scenarios that can be identified as the death or termination of an organization. Change in name, look, and function, or being absorbed into a larger organization are examples in which organizations can be terminated. Police agencies can be disbanded, correctional facilities can be closed, and agencies can cease to exist altogether. But some of these deaths can be considered to be a part of a bigger reconstructing effort. And it's difficult to determine the actual death or whether it's reconstruction. So, for example, police organizations can become part of a bigger police organization. They can be absorbed in each other, but still keep their individual identities. And police organizations can be considered to be terminated when funding is no longer available and they are no longer sanctioned from local government, meaning that they no longer have the official authority provided by the government to serve as the police organization for the municipality. The resilience and decline of public organizations. There are 3 factors that enhance resilience, and these are going to be the creation through legal statute, the budgeting process, and powerful interests. So creation, normally the agency is created through some form of legislation, and it's not likely that they're going to go back and repeal it with further legislation, as this would also be admitting that they made a mistake by enacting that legislation to begin with. The budgeting process actually favors police because, believe it or not, new budgets are not drafted every year, and it's usually just a case of whether they want to increase or decrease funding to that particular agency. Powerful interests, such as employees and communities, will resist the termination of an agency. And then we also have things that will reduce it, such as stakeholder constraints. Which basically government officials and the public, when it relates to the budget, reduce the ability of the agency to adapt to improve effectiveness because they have to make sure that they're within what those government officials require, and also they're subject to funding, and they need to make sure that they're using the funding effectively. So they can't come back and say that they weren't using the funding as they should, where it is coming from the public. Symbolic creations, which essentially are reactionary creations, such as the TSA after 9/11. So basically the TSA was put into power, or created, if you will, and say something else comes up down the line that could use more funding or that would be more important to the government at the particular time, the TSA program could be defunded or disbanded, and then we would be back to kind of where we were at pre-9/11 times. So the fact that it's symbolic kind of reduces its resilience a little bit. And organizations that are small in size have a hard time making structural changes to keep up with what's occurring in the community. They're not able to have specialized units, such as like drug units and gang units, so they're not able to keep up with those bigger organizations. And when an organization is terminated, we need to replace the loss of the services because obviously law enforcement still needs to happen in those places. So these organizations being terminated creates a need for those services to be provided by other agencies. And these agencies can include neighboring agencies, state agencies, and sheriff agencies. It can also, as I said before, involve the merging of 2 different agencies. But there are some negative consequences that the community may face as a result. Contracting police forces may result in a decline in the services provided. As contracts typically focus on the amount of time spent in that area, not specifically on the effects, such as the reduction of crime and the fear thereof. The public supports smaller agencies, increasing the likelihood that they're going to cooperate with police, such as reporting to them and helping out with investigations. So those are going to be the negative things that are kind of going to take away from the policing in that area. However, there are some potential positive outcomes of getting a larger department, and that would be higher specialization and more available equipment, and sometimes it can also decrease the cost. So we're going to talk about the first article now, and it's going to be on bureaucracy, managerial disorganization, and administrative breakdowns in criminal justice agencies. So basically what Freitas and Vaughn did is they looked at more than 12 case studies on criminal justice agencies to examine administrative breakdown and managerial disorganization theories. They viewed these through 6 different lenses, and they are goals and objectives, division of labor, hierarchy of authority, command and control, accountability, and communication. Goals and objectives were defined as cleared goals that clarify procedures to enable agencies to unify in their direction. The lack of these clear goals and objectives can lead to an increase in the amount of discretion subordinates have as a result of these ambiguous instructions. The division of labor was broke down into 3 different functions. They were identified as line personnel, which implement the organizational goals and objectives. And these are police officers, correctional officers, probation officers, juvenile officers, We also have specialized staff, which supports line personnel by giving advice regarding planning, research, and the law, and these can be represented by statisticians and attorneys. And then we also have the auxiliary functions, which provide support via communications, maintenance, record keeping, and human resources. These can be your dispatchers and the individuals who are in charge of the evidence rooms. And it's important to assign tasks to individuals based on training, merit, specialization, and expertise, as these people are going to be the best fit for those positions. And it leads to a more successful work environment and faster response to crises, as these people are trained and have the expertise in these particular divisions of labor. And then we have hierarchy. And basically agencies that function well are able to control subordinates via the chain of command. Authority lies in the position, not the person. So it shouldn't matter who's in charge. It just matters that there is a spot for that person to be in charge. There is that position that exists, as that is what is respected. A strong chain of command leads to increased loyalty and more subordination among employees. However, a weak chain of command can result in conflicting orders, as now these objectives and goals aren't going to be delivered effectively. We have command and control. Unity of command, basically employees receive their orders from one boss. So you're not receiving your orders from 10 different people, which might be conflicting because they might not be on the same page, where you're kind of trying to decide on what to do. We also have span of control, which is the max number of subordinates a supervisor in a position can supervise effectively. Ideally, what you want is a narrow span of control, because they're easier to control during times of crises. And wide spans where someone would be responsible for a lot of different people, they're obviously going to be more difficult to influence and more difficult to control during crises. And then we have accountability. Basically, accountability cannot be delegated. So if I'm the person who's in charge of a situation and the organization is told to do something and I delegate it to the next person, I'm not passing on the responsibility or the accountability of that getting done. I'm just passing on the actual task. So if that task doesn't get done effectively, I'm still accountable for it. And agencies experiencing administrative breakdown, the supervisors often blame others in the organization as opposed to accepting accountability themselves. Recognizing and accepting responsibilities is necessary to avoid this breakdown. And if accountability is not implemented within an agency, sometimes outside forces will force it upon them. And these are like courts or review boards. And organizations can increase accountability by limiting managerial discretion. And they identified two different types of discretion. We have discretionary decisions and non-discretionary decisions. So basically, if there's a discretionary decision, normally it's minor decisions made by the manager themselves. And then we have non-discretionary decisions, which are normally bigger ones that are made by outside forces. So they're not the ones in charge of everything. There are checks and balances there. And the sixth most important lens is communication, as it allows all of the others to function. Written procedures and clearly defined flow of communication are important. As the written procedures, people can read them, and allowing for flow of communication is important, so that way information gets where it needs to be from one place to another. Flexible communication allows for the agency to respond to breakdown in crises, so being able to circumvent the process, if you will, allows for better reaction time. And reducing damage from a crisis requires command and control, communication channels, and establishing valued leaders to occur before the crisis, not after. So these particular scenarios need to be in place before the crisis occurs. So basically what they found is successful bureaucratic agencies possess managers with effective communication skills, the ability to implement a functional span of control, strict accountability. They're able to implement formal and written and informal verbal communications within the agency. They're able to instill clear goals and objectives, and they're also able to delegate tasks. The inability to implement these will lead to the breakdown and disorganization within the organization. And the next article is going to be the case of deadly force. And basically, Killinger talks about two different types of knowledge that are going to help reduce instances of deadly force. And these are going to be tactical knowledge, which involves gathering all the information available regarding a situation before committing to a course of action. So basically, the officer is going to keep their distance from the individual that's posing a threat so they can increase their reaction time. They're going to try to gather information from their surroundings. And concealment, which involves the placing of a barrier between the officer and the individual. So something like a police car, a car door, a tree, a pole, a wall, something like that. So that way they're protected, and they'll have more time to react as they're protected standing behind something. And both of these steps can actually act as a deterrent, or as I said multiple times before, increasing the amount of time an officer has to respond to a situation. And not all deaths, injuries, and other negative situations are avoidable, but prevention is important as it does provide the opportunity to reduce or avoid these outcomes. And that being said, we're focusing on officer-involved shootings, which, as we know, are rare. However, most of these can actually be avoided. So what they did is they used the normal accident theory to kind of explain why some things go wrong. And this is due to the complexity of the system and the extent to which they are coupled. Basically, what it says is that the more complex and the more tightly coupled the system is, the increased likelihood that the system will have problems, which may lead to negative outcomes. So basically, as the number of elements in a system increases, the interactions increase, which raises the level of complexity. So, for example, if you have a large group of officers that are dealing with one individual and each one is yelling a different order, it's obviously going to get very complex very quickly because they don't know who to listen to and there's a lot of yelling, as opposed to having just one person doing the talking. And as elements of the system become more tightly coupled, the amount of slack decreases. So again, we can use the walking through the hallway example. If you're walking too close to the person in front of you and they stop suddenly, you're going to walk into the back of them because you didn't have enough slack, enough time to stop before you hit them. The same thing happens when it comes to instances of deadly force. If the slack isn't there, they're not able to react, and sometimes negative situations come out of it. So, as I said before, the more tightly coupled the system and the more elements that are involved makes it more likely that something negative will happen. So, we're going to talk about the case in which Diallo was shot and killed by 4 plainclothes officers. The 4 plainclothes officers were in an unmarked car, and they saw this African-American male, identified as Diallo, acting in a manner which they saw as suspicious. The car stopped, and 2 officers got out and confronted him, at which time he retreated and began reaching into his right pocket. The officers drew their guns as they feared that he was going to pull out a firearm, and they ran into the area where he was to try to stop him. They were both yelling at him as he pulled a dark object from his pocket while turning in their direction. As he turned in their direction, he began to extend his right hand, at which point one of the officers yelled "gun." Both officers began to fire at him while backing out of the area. The other 2 cops were running, obviously, to help their fellow officers, at which point one of the officers fell down the stairs, and they thought that he had been shot. They also then looked back into where Diallo was and saw him still standing there with the item in his hand, at which time they began shooting. They fired many rounds, 19 of which hit his body, causing him to fall and resulting in his death. They then walked over to check on him, and they found that the item was not a gun, and it was a wallet. So we can see that there were many issues with this situation. And using the normal accident theory, do you think this situation could be avoided? I definitely do think so. I feel if they would have kept their distance, that would have given them opportunity to respond and see that it was a wallet and not a gun. However, they were too close and they weren't able to actually see that it was a wallet, so they reacted very quickly. And also having both officers yelling at him kind of made the situation more complex than what it had to be. If one officer was giving instructions and the other one was kind of just standing there, if they thought it was a gun, kind of holding the gun and acting as kind of like a backup person in case something does go wrong. But all 4 officers were acquitted. And it's kind of interesting to hear people's opinions on this as to whether or not they should have been.
The next section of this text lays the groundwork for the 3 previous relationships that we discussed. And within the criminal justice system, collaborations deal with like a myriad of issues, including drugs, fugitives, homeland security, they have domestic violence, task force prisoner reentry. Now be when the law enforcement is working with an academic group to figure out what's the best way to lower recidivism and to reintegrate into society. And in the first section we're talking about is law enforcement task forces, which the most common are multi-jurisdictional task forces that combine like a local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. And these mostly deal with like drug problems and the fugitives that we were just talking about in Homeland Security. Not too much with the more localized domestic violence issues or prisoner reentry. But within these, there are two types of collaborating structures. First, you have the horizontal structures, when organizations may be drawn from regional or contiguous jurisdictions, where you're going to take like this would be taking like Seaside Heights, working with Seaside Park because they're on the same island, and then they contribute with Toms River, which is the biggest city within that region, and they try to pull together their resources to combat crime in their area. The vertical approach is when you take different forms, different levels of the government. This can be from local, state, county, all the way to the federal government. This also, we can take a Seaside Heights example. When we had the bomber at the Marine Corps 5K last year, the bombs went off, and Seaside Heights immediately went and responded to the situation. But then, since it was a terrorist attack, FBI came in, and they worked together for months on end to build a case against this man and to make sure that they can look through this person's past to see if they can find out where the funding came from or if he was part of a larger organization. The Rock that was previously mentioned in Trenton, this is an example of basically both, because in The Rock we take horizontal approach by taking law enforcement agencies from Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and some Connecticut, because this is the metropolitan area. And then we go into the vertical approach because we have all different levels, from Department of Homeland Security, FBI, New Jersey State Police, and with the occasional local agency meeting with these organizations there. And the size ranges from these multi-jurisdictional task forces can range from several people or several departments to several hundred people. Moving on to the next section, we have the police corrections partnerships. And these task forces are largely made up of only law enforcement agencies. They don't really bring in anybody else like public health agencies. They seek to involve staff from both the agencies in joint performance of a line or support function and provide benefits to both agencies. This would be an example with the parole officers and the police of a local town. They come together for 5 main reasons, according to the author of this text. The first is the enhanced supervision. This is when police and probation basically come together and they want to say that, you know, if parolee John was out on the streets, we need to make sure that he is being supervised from the minute he leaves his house to the minute he gets home. Now, likely this isn't going to happen. That can be considered harassment, but the parole officer would be will be in contact with the local police department and say, I met up with parolee John today. Can you keep an eye on him? I think he might be up to no good. And then that's what they'll do. They'll do periodic check-ins. The second reason would be fugitive apprehension. Fugitive apprehension occurs when a parole officer is looking for somebody that they can't find, one of their parolees, and then they collaborate with the police department to really go find them. We can also go one further, and the parole officer can enlist the help of an outside agency like Dog the Bounty Hunter to find their parolee. And lastly, we can go into the third section is information sharing, which is one of the biggest impediments to all interagency collaboration, like we said, with turf wars and information. But this is when law enforcement is basically the information is shared from parole to law enforcement, not the other way around. Because the parole officers know the criminal better than the law enforcement because they just came out of jail, they have their cases, and they know everything that they should know about the person. So they let the law enforcement know that this person might be prone to hanging out in this section. They are prone to their past is in criminal burglaries, just to let them know and where they're going to be living, who they're going to be staying with. The fourth reason is specialized enforcement with drugs and gangs. This is pretty self-explanatory with drugs and gangs. If there's a problem with these groups of people, they'll both pull their resources together to help lower the chances of drugs and gangs permeating through society. And fifth is interagency problem solving. That is self-explanatory. But one of the most recognized and most frequently emulated enhanced supervision partnerships, which was the first reason, began in Boston in 1992. It was called Operation Nightlight. It's where police and probation actively patrolled criminal places. So they pulled all their resources together in Boston to combat, which they used to have a large gang problem there, and they figured that this is where people are hanging out. We're gonna make sure that we patrol this area and let them know we know where they're hanging out here, and it really dispersed the crowd. And when you disperse a crowd of people coming together, it really lowers the rate of cultural transmission between gang members, and forming new bonds, and possibly coming up with new ways to commit crimes. The benefits of all these partnerships, the author says, is to increase supervision and decrease the span of control, which I think is the most important. Parole officers sometimes have 50, 60 different parolees that they have to take care of one by one. So they can't really do their job the greatest by going to check in on them once a week, once every 2 weeks. Sometimes, in larger areas where they have more span of control, it's the face-to-face is a lot more difficult than a phone call. So the decrease in span of control happens because the parole officer can rely on the police to help them out.
The next article that we're going to discuss is the intelligence fusion process for state, local, and tribal law enforcement. Before 9/11, regional intelligence centers, or intelligent fusion centers, were focused on drug control as well as gun trafficking. Information sharing before 9/11 was very inefficient, especially between different agencies. The federal government saw the value in these centers and began to fund them after 9/11. And fusion centers rely on four presumptions, and basically they are that intelligence plays a vital role in preventing terror attacks. It is essential to fuse a broader range of data collection, including non-traditional data sources, such as using the private sector. State, local, and tribal law enforcement and public sector agencies may be able to obtain information that may be central to a threat assessment. So even though it might not be something serious to them, once put in for analysis, it can put together a puzzle that can lead to finding a terror plot and being able to stop it. And state and local agencies can benefit from these centers as well. So it's not just a federal thing. There's information sharing back and forth between all levels. And basically they started off focusing on terrorism, but then they moved to a more all hazards approach. As people who are involved in terrorism are often also involved in other activities while they're preparing for their attack. So basically the structure and success. Structures are different in different states. So the facility in one may be differently run to the facility in another, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's a weakness. It just means that it's catering to the environment that it's in, so it's going to be more efficient. And the more limited the information, the more limited the quality of the intelligence is going to be. So if we're just taking intelligence from one single source, and we're not using different locations and methods of getting the information, our intelligence isn't going to be that great. So using information from multiple sources is going to increase the quality of the intelligence. Fusion centers are new, and therefore there's not a lot of information on their effectiveness. However, there are a few ways that have been kind of determined to measure their success. And one of these methods is the information being shared among all levels of the law enforcement agencies. So one isn't just getting all of the information while the other one is not getting any information, because that's not kind of a symbiotic relationship. You want to make sure everybody's benefiting from it since everyone's doing the work. And is the information able to be obtained and disseminated while still protecting civil rights of citizens? With all of this information kind of being tossed around, we want to make sure that it's not getting into the wrong hands, as we are, doing things with the public sector, private sector. We want to make sure that we're protecting our citizens as well. If we do that, it's not going to be very effective. And has the information and intelligence resulted in preventing or reducing crime or terrorism? I feel like that's a fair kind of way of measuring it. And it's kind of also hard to measure what did not happen, though. So we'll see if there's a decrease. I guess that's a good way of measuring it. And also, is the fusion center cost effective? Which again, it's kind of difficult to measure things that haven't happened, so you can't measure the impact of an attack or a disaster that was avoided if it hasn't happened. So it's kind of hard to see if it is cost effective. And the second article we're going to discuss is an example of procedural justice for victims and defendants. And procedural justice is the focus on the process and not just the results of the case. So we're not just focusing on the end results, we're focusing on what happens throughout the process. And factors that increase one's opinion regarding the fairness of proceedings is the opportunity to provide input and being treated with respect. So basically, the case that was examined in this was about a domestic violence court, and domestic violence is a national issue. So basically, they created these specialized domestic violence courts. And procedural justice, it has been found, definitely has an impact on domestic violence cases. The way in which a sentence is posed is actually way more important than the actual sentence itself, as offenders are more likely to comply if they view the process as fair. That being said, the county that they looked at was Lexington County in South Carolina, and they obviously looked at their domestic violence court. And basically, their court is a multi-agency collaborative approach. It includes 2 investigators, a prosecutor, a victim advocate, a court administrator, 2 magistrate-level judges, a mental health counselor, and a legal advocate. And basically what the study did is it talked to 50 victims and 50 offenders, and they were interviewed after their experience in the court regarding their perceptions of the fairness and justice, and also their level of satisfaction. Offenders had 4 options, and it included pretrial intervention, putting in a guilty plea, having a bench trial, or having a jury trial. Within all of these, there was a 26-week therapy program, and there were also no contact orders initiated, so that way the offender wouldn't be talking to the victim. And again, the approach was very collaborative. Judges were seen to care about what was best for everybody, especially the victim as a children, and having a fair outcome. So they wanted to make sure that if the offender was the main breadwinner, that they weren't going to negatively affect the family by not having them be able to afford food or take care of themselves, have the essentials for life. So they kind of took that into account. And the results were majority of the victims and offenders felt as though they were treated with respect. Both categories reported at over 85%, which I think is great, considering the fact even the offenders felt that way. And more than 70% of victims rated their impression on how the case was handled as good or excellent, and 45% of offenders reported good or excellent, while approximately 35% reported that they went fair. So a majority of the offenders feel that it was good or excellent or fair. So obviously sometimes they're receiving a punishment, so that might affect how they feel about it. It was also found that 9 out of 10 victims reported that they felt like they had adequate time to address the court and kind of provide that voice, which was one of the concepts which relates to procedural justice that was talked about in the beginning. And 70% of offenders felt like they were able to have enough time. 70% of the victims felt as though the judge was concerned with their side, but when it comes to victims, and 45% of the offenders felt the judge was concerned with their side. So I mean, it's the statistics are a little low when it comes to the offenders. Majority of them, for the most part, feel like it was fair and they had a good opportunity to voice their side of the story, but when it comes to whether or not they felt like their side of the story was being listened to, it seems the majority of the offenders felt as though it wasn't. However, the victims felt as though it was. And another interesting statistic that came out of this was that 90% of victims who reported said that they would recommend reporting to others, which is really great because it's going to increase reporting, as normally it's something that's difficult to kind of come forward and state what happened.
The last part of the interagency collaboration before we go into the articles is the concept of pulling levers and focused deterrence partnerships. Pulling levers fascinates me. It was first taken into account in Boston. and there's six steps in the pulling lever strategy. First is to select a particular crime problem. In this case, let's select gang violence in your neighborhood. The second is coordinate an interagency enforcement group. So how are we going to enforce the pulling levers approach? Is it going to just be police and probation, or is it going to be probation, parole, the district attorney's office, or juvenile? But in this case, with gang violence, we'll take the police, we'll go into parole officers as well, district attorney's office, and juvenile courts. The third would be conduct research to identify key offenders of groups of offenders. So this is where you bring in an academic sort who's going to do field research in your area to see who's more likely to join a gang, what are the age demographics of the gang, what types of crimes they're committing, and where are they all hanging out at that. The fourth would be communicate the deterrence message to offenders. So you have to let these gang members know that you are going to be having a huge crackdown on gang violence in your neighborhood. You have to let them know that they have the opportunity to get out now. And if they don't, this is what's going to happen. This is in hopes to deter them from future gang violence, and which will then lower the crime, and which will also lower the amount of work you'll have to do as a collaborating agency. The fifth step is to provide services to offenders and communicate the voice of the community. So it's not just going to be stop gang offending right now, but you have to say stop gang offending right now, and then offer them an outlet, offer them something to do. Say you can go get help at this organization. Do you need a job? Here's how you can get some new job skills, and really let them know that the community that they are in is not based around gang violence. That gang violence is a problem in the community, and that you are a problem to the community. And the last is to direct the special law enforcement operation. So the way this is going to go is when you communicate the deterrence message to the offenders, and after getting all the research about them, you tell them that if you are caught with a gun, this is where the district attorney's office comes in, that if you're caught with a gun, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure you go to jail for the longest amount of time. So not just a 2-year gun sentence, you're going to get 10 years because you were also, you had drugs on you, you did this, you did that, and they're going to maximize the amount of time in an effort to get you off the streets. So they're going to use you as well as snitches to get rid of the rest of the gang as well. So this creates fear in the gang itself because they think other people are going to snitch on them. In Boston, they did the pulling levers approach, and they actually had a gun turn-in program in the beginning to try to get the guns off the street, and they found out that the juveniles were largely making up these gangs when they did the academic part. So they really targeted the juveniles, and they offered them services that were more normative than a gang culture. So when the special law enforcement operation went in, it was a 24/7 approach on getting rid of gangs in the community between every law enforcement agency in Boston, from the police, probation, parole officers, the district attorney's office, and the juvenile detention or juvenile courts and corrections. In the next section, Kat is going to delve into the different readings that are associated with interagency collaborations. The last section of our presentation has to do with power and organizations. In the power and organizations section, the readings seek to illustrate how subordinates, suspects, inmates, and clients are controlled. In this section, they'll highlight how to define power, the power, authority, and leadership relationship, and the basis of power, which is going to be the most important section of the part of this section. And then to apply this in the criminal justice, we have to see how power influences behavior. This is going to be talked a lot about in the corrections and parole aspect, and then the effectiveness of power. First of all, to define power, we must understand that power is a tool for controlling and obtaining compliance from others. It is extremely important in the criminal justice system because law enforcement needs to secure obedience from typically uncooperative clients on a daily basis. Power defined it's kind of like the term of terrorism, where there's not an acceptance between the definition globally, but there's many different definitions that make up power. But all the concepts is that it's a tool for controlling and obtaining the compliance from another person, but it all surrounds that it's a potential influence on something in a situation. Power has the capacity to affect or affect the organizational outcomes. In one example, they said A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. And that all comes from either what we'll call position power or personal power later on. Then we go into the themes that surround power from seven different researchers. And the first is that power is an inherently social phenomenon. It's impossible to study without understanding the dynamics between those who possess power, who we call the power holder, and those who experience it, the power recipient. Then within this, there's a paradox of dispossession with power. It's the idea that the less one has to lose, the less one has, then the less one has to lose. So it's hard to exact power over somebody who has nothing to lose, which can be very important in the criminal justice field, because a lot of criminals who are in jail have not a lot to lose, especially because they're waking up and they walk around in a circle in a rec yard and then they go to bed and they don't have much to lose. Or you can look at it the other way, is that they have a lot to lose because there's several liberties they get in jail that they must be they have to be careful not to lose, which we'll learn in our first article on that. The second theme is Raven and Mitzberg's definition highlight that power is a capacity or ability of something to be energized, mobilized, or exercised. And this is kind of in relationship to what you would learn in a science class of kinetic power. And in this, the power holder must have the will and the skill to use the power he or she possesses. So in terms of a parole officer, if the officer chooses to overlook these behaviors that a parolee is using and not complying with the technical aspects of this probation, and doesn't exact their power to make sure that they get in trouble, then it can be very detrimental to the person's power status, because once you lose power, it's very hard to regain it. The third theme addresses what this capacity or ability, which we will label as power, allows the power holder to do. This is from Dahl, Mechanic, and Emerson. They establish power as the capacity or ability to get others, the power recipients, to comply or conform to the demands of the power holder, even in the face of physical, verbal, or other forms of resistance. And finally, power relations can exhibit reciprocal characteristics. So there was an example with in Baltimore where the officers were basically told they had to do police stops and write tickets, and this is similar to what the quota system happens to do, which is illegal. Now, in this example, the officers were not completely powerless, even though they were told by their superiors to do this. Because of this, created a low morale and anger over this new standard. Some of the officers stopped writing tickets in general or making arrests, which was power in numbers in that situation. To understand power further, we have a chart that will start off with the source, the base of power, which will then yield where you get your power. And the base of power is going to be important. There's going to be 5 concrete ones that we'll learn about in the next section. And once you get your power, you have influence, which then leads to the compliance, well, the hopeful compliance from the person you're trying to exert your power upon. Power is often confused with or used with the word authority and leadership. But authority represents the right to make demands of others. That some people call this legitimate power, which will be a base of power that we'll learn in the next section. Authority and power can coexist. People of authority can use power. For example, leaders and organizations use power and authority to facilitate the achievements of organizations. So the authority lies in the position which they hold, but they exert the power which comes from the position. But power should not be confused with leadership. Leadership requires some degree of goal compatibility between leaders and followers, but power holders, and power recipients need not agree on the purpose of their actions. So second, the leadership emphasizes influence that moves from leader to follower. But people can possess power that aren't in leadership positions. So we just were talking about the Baltimore Police Department. The low-level patrol officers do not have power over their leaders, or they're not in a leadership position, but they held power, especially when they were in numbers. This can also be seen with the secretary in an office. She has power, but she's not in a leadership position. Moving forward, an important concept in power is the base of power, meaning something that backs up the power at the power holder's request. And it's also known as like the source of where they get their power. So there's 5 power bases of power, or sources of power, that were originally thought up, and then there was 2 others that were then brought into the picture. The first is coercive power. It's when he or she can punish, or at least is believed to be able to punish, those who don't comply with demands. This can be seen with the correctional officers in the prisons. Reward power is the ability to reward compliant behavior. Now, this can be in a negative way or in a positive way. So in a positive way, this would be the chief of police handing out raises to his staff because they were doing well, and he has the power to do that, he or she. Then this can also be seen in a rewards way in the prison, where the correction officer gives more time in a rec yard to an inmate who is complying with the everyday demands of jail life. Next is the legitimate power, which I believe is the most important of the powers. It's the belief that the power holder has the right, usually derived from their position, to make the demands. Therefore, the position is the source of this power. This would be the chief of police. Everybody knows that whoever is chief has the power to make the demands of the organization. But even if it's someone you don't like that becomes chief, they have the same power as the chief before him. Next is referent power. The power recipient admires, respects, or seeks to associate with the power holder. This can be seen as a field training officer has power over a probationary officer. Both are maybe in the same level on a vertical scale, but the probationary officer is learning from the field training officer and seeks to comply with them because it would make everything go smoother and they want to make them happy. Last is the expert power, which is basically someone who has extensive knowledge of an area or subject that gives them power because of their knowledge. Expert testimony in a case against a defendant in a criminal case is also often seen as very powerful because the person knows a lot. They can just be anybody. They can make $10,000 a year, but they're seen as an expert in their field, so they have a lot of power in what they know. Additional sources that were then brought in to this field of study is information power, which is people who control information flows within the organization. So this can be the secretary in the office who has all the information of how to contact different police departments, or this can be, police informants on the street. They can tell you what's happening on the street, and it can be very powerful in situations. So sometimes they have power over the officers because they know what's going to happen, and the officer needs to know. And then you have the resource power, those who can control or can secure much needed resources for the organization, which also goes back to a secretary because he or she will know who they can call in a situation, or who they can call in a situation where you need to get more resources for a police department. And then you have the charismatic power, which is self-explanatory. Somebody who just holds power because of their charisma and the way they present themselves. On a lighter note, this would be somebody like an entertainer who walks into a room and everybody immediately obeys what they're saying just because they have so much respect for that person's charisma. So then these bases of power get put into 2 different categories. We have position power and personal power. So position power would be legitimate, resource, reward, coercive, and information power. This is all power that derives from the person's position itself. But then you have personal power, which is the expert, the referent, and the charismatic, which derives from the person themselves, and it can move from place to place. In terms of the effectiveness of power, Uckel and Falvey found that perceptions of managerial effectiveness were closely linked to the manager's perceived personal power than to his or her positional power. So people tend to respect the power of people who deserve respect. So there can be somebody who you really don't like who gets into the chief's position, and then they tell you to do things, and that people will follow, but it won't be as effective. They won't do it at the right ways, or maybe they'll lag on and decide that they're not going to do it at this time, whatever you tell them to do. But it'll get done because they don't want to lose their job. But it's more effective when people see the power coming from your personal self. So maybe you're an expert in your field, you're charismatic. In this section of power, we have 3 different readings that go into how power is perceived, or how you can effectively use power in law enforcement. This will be seen in a correctional facility. And there's one article that goes through the gender roles with male and female correctional officers and how they have to sometimes change the way they base their power. In the first section, in our first reading, we have this article called "The Defects of Total Power" by Gresham Sykes, and this actually comes from his book, The Society of Captives. So conventional wisdom suggests that correctional officers possess total power over inmates, but what we read, Sykes' research, which had to do with the New Jersey State Prison, led him to conclude that his view was purely fictional. That the position as the keepers or the custodians of the jail, because they're the supervising role, afforded them considerable amounts of legitimate power, but it actually did not, and inmates have no duty to comply with correctional officers' demands. This then brings us to the punishments and rewards that we see in this article. It's available to correctional officers through a coercive and reward power, but are neither effective to ensure compliance. So if prison personnel are unable to secure compliance via their legitimate power, how then is the control achieved? Sykes argued that control can be achieved only by allowing the power of the correctional staff to be weakened. So what he means is that the correctional officers have to get into these things called exchange relationships, where they don't act on minor misdemeanors that occur in prison, to ensure that the inmates comply with later rules on maybe harder things that will be for them in their shift. So if they see someone cursing at another inmate or cursing at an officer, they might not write them up, and this will weaken their power because they're supposed to do it, but it'll make the inmate maybe follow the commands in a later time. This is what these relationships are what they call the moral blackmail that they have to do in their everyday life. More specific, this article focused on 300 employees of the New Jersey State Prison that I said were known as the custodian force. So the officers, the section looked at the different charge slips that they had to do for minor things, and what Sykes finds is that the people had to weaken their power to ensure that the larger problems are solved. In our last two sections, we have two more articles. The first is the perceived office power and probationary compliance. This is taking a look at the limits of individual control, especially in probation field. This is by Smith et al. And it looks at the limits to individual control. This study looks at the power to dynamics between probation officers and their offenders. There was 376 probationers, and the researchers measured the self-reports compliance about how often they follow the rules or directions of their probation officer. And this was in terms of drug use and whether or not they violate conditions of their parole, like technical violations. The IVs, the independent variables to test on these, were the bases of power. So the reward-based, the coercive-based, the legitimate-based, referent-based, or expert. And they use the Likert scale to test like how strongly they feel that these types of bases of power were contributed to this person, their probation officer. Then they tested these across the race and age and education and employment of the probationers. So the findings suggested that expert power was strongly correlated with the most compliance, and also with legitimate and reference power. So 68% of the probationers reported that they followed the rules that their probation officer set out for them and had 0 violations, whereas 32% said they had 1 or more violations that the probation officer didn't know about, and 69% said they followed the rules with drugs. So probationers were surveyed in this about the power bases of their probation officer, and probationers tend to rank expert power and legitimate power the highest, followed closely by coercive and referent power. Given that the probation officers had few rewards to hand out, Smith et al. Said that probationers viewed reward power as weak in this situation. So researchers had expected, Smith et al. Had expected that power and probation compliance, like complying with the drug requirements and to have successful probation, to be positively related. So the perceived power of probation officers increases as well. But contrary to what they expected, perceptions of power and probationer compliance were largely unrelated to the sex of the probationer, and the employment characteristics were actually more predictive of the success. But the final discussion, the conclusion section, Smith et al. Believe that probation officers are either ineffectual in supervising their clients or not adequately exercising the power that they do actually possess. And the next article is Gender Power and Reciprocity in a Correctional Setting by Jen and Kirsting. This is a very understudied topic, and it's very important because women have to violate traditional power roles or the traditional power relationships because they have power over men in correctional settings, which is something that society is not used to. So the method of this experiment was they mailed questionnaires to both men and women in correction societies. Only a small sample was retrieved because of the lack of response rate, but the questions asked scenario questions about how often they would overlook minor infractions, like cursing at the correctional officer by an inmate, and how about gambling with the inmates, or smoking and non-smoking sessions by the inmates. Then these responses were then randomized, and people were brought in for actual interviews. And the findings of these responses were that there was no gender differences in any of the situations that they asked for, and it was just those 3 situations. The second part was the open-ended responses to the exchange relationships that we talked about in the previous section as a coercive power technique. The corrections officers gain inmate compliance in areas that count in exchange for overlooking minor rule violations, like we stated. They hypothesized that women corrections officers would make more exchange relationships than male inmates, but the findings revealed that officers, regardless of genders, actually do this as a part of control strategy, even though they didn't write it on their initial form that they submitted, because this was found in the interview format. They mostly said that everything depends on the situation. Selective enforcement is used, but can be dangerous if there's different styles used by guards in the same block at different shifts. So, like the person who's working the 6 to 2 shift, if they're more lenient and they have more exchange relationships with the inmates, it might be detrimental to the person who comes in from the 3 to 11 shift, because they might not be comfortable with that source of relationship. And then based on the inmate's behavior, this is also based on the inmate's behavior. If you have somebody who's an inmate that listens a lot, they might get more rewards than another inmate, which goes back to the first article that we learned about. If they're getting more rewards, it's weakening your power structure. But these alternative methods that are created in these exchange relays are all part of informal approaches that deal with informal punishments too.